Video, we're going to be looking at a number of things, kind of wrapping up our conversation on personality. We're going to look at the biological basis of personality. We're going to talk briefly about how we assess personality. We're going to say some of that for in class, and then finally we'll talk about what does it mean to have a self. The ideas around, you know, who we are, the interpersonal self, the what self-esteem is. Another major term coming out of this unit will be self-efficacy, but we'll wrap up with conversations on that. So, looking at biological bases of personality, um, you guys should be, experts in understanding how we do this, right? It's all twin studies. It's all, identical versus fraternal twins, and looking at similarities and differences when they're raised together or raised apart. So let's take a look at some of the data here. There is a large genetic component to our personality. As you can see, twin studies support the strong influence that genes have on our personality, right? Identical twins show correlations of about 50, 0.50 on personality traits like the big five, occupational interests, what type of jobs they want to do, their religious attitudes, regardless if they were raised together or raised apart. Whereas we can see something more closely related to like biology, right? The fingerprint ridge count, that those being much higher because again, genetics, show that's more biologically and genetically driven. Whereas things like personality are pretty highly correlated, right? 0.50 is pretty high. It seems like it's a coin flip, but it's actually, that's pretty significant. That our responses on a personality questionnaire, at least these twin studies, right, show that there's a lot of similarity here in terms of how this all, works. Same thing with occupational interest. Remember the Jim twins, right? They both loved was it woodworking, and they were both law enforcement officers in their respective counties, right? Right, that shows that there's a combination here. And then at the end of that video, if you remember, there were two twins who were deeply religious. Right, that also shows up in the data when we look at these correlation studies between identical twins. So, our personality has a genetic component, right? That's what we can learn from this information. Now, where do these things end up in the brain? And, is there a part of the brain that deals with, us being open to new experiences? Well, probably not, right? In terms of specific personality traits, and these correlations between those traits and, brain volume, brain activity in different regions do support some of this, right? Like there are certain parts, like the middle frontal gyrus here, which tends to be active when we are feeling conscientious, like when we're, looking at things like planning, self control, right? That part of the brain tends to be activated during that, right? The prefrontal cortex, right? So when we're acting in a conscientious way, certain parts of the brain do respond specifically to those types of thoughts and feelings. Same thing with neuroticism, right? When we're feeling anxious and worried, that's the anterior cingulate, if you remember, in the hippocampus, right? Those are things that deal with stress and emotional reactivity. So, of course, our limbic system is going to be activated when we're feeling neurotic and anxious. So, we do see that there are some similarities. We can't really point to like, this is the part of the brain. Like, if I can turn this part of the brain off, then I won't feel blank. As we know, it doesn't quite work like that. But we do know that there are association areas, right, where these things tend to, show activity at least when we're thinking and acting in certain ways. So, long story short, there's a biological component to our personality, right? Both in our genetic component and in our brain. Now, how do we assess personality, right? Like, how do we do these personality tests and right these different perspectives on personality, whether that's humanistic or trait? How do we even do this, right? How do we what are the processes that are behind all of these things? So really, it's kind of tough, right? If you think about If I'm taking a personality test, couldn't I lie, right? Couldn't I lie on what I'm putting down, especially if it's something that makes me uncomfortable? And won't that then impact my scores, right, or what my results are? So that's the first way that we really look at personality, is what we call a self-report inventory, right? Um, and this is really prominent in trait theorists, right? Because again, trait theorists tend to look at our reactions over time and how we respond over time. These kind of um, underlying, drivers of our actions and thoughts. So trait theorists, social cognitive personality theorists like Bandura are going to really rely on these self-report questionnaires. Um, we know that there's actually pretty high measures of reliability and validity among these. Self-reports can also be done, well, not self-reports, but reports can also be done by friends, right? So if I'm filling out some sort of personality test, I can also give that to, my girlfriend, my parents, my best, some of my best friends, and have them fill it out about me. And we actually see some pretty high correlations between the results, right? So people do have a sense of, who they are in terms of their personality and how they act. Um, Now, like I said, there could be things that I don't want to fill out, that could, that I'm uncomfortable with, or that if I'm not consciously aware, right? Like if I seem like I'm not open, or if I kind of have my body language is kind of betraying me when I'm trying to be extroverted, right? Then that's going to be something that I might not pick up on that someone else might. So, right, these self-report inventories are good, right? How likely are you to agree with the statement? I talk to a lot of different people at parties. I sympathize with other people's feelings. I pay attention to details. I get stressed out easily. I have a vivid imagination, right? You can see how these things would be somewhat easily to self-report, but also could have, I could think that I sympathize with others' feelings, but some people might say, no, he's actually kind of cold sometimes, right? So it kind of depends on that. Now, let's throw this all up in the air too when we talk about the role that situations play, right? Um, I might sympathize with other people's feelings in my classroom, um, but maybe not on the highway when I'm driving home, or vice versa, right? Like I might be really sympathetic, but when it comes to my you got to do my work and you can't, whatever. Um, you guys get what I'm saying. So this idea of that we're always aware of everything in our personality isn't necessarily always true, right? So we can use self-report inventories. They're widely used. They are kind of really the gold standard because there's really no other way to do it. But taking a personality test online, whether that's something like on BuzzFeed where you're going to find out which type of cheesecake you are, versus something that's more something like the personality test we're going to take in class. They're self-reported, but if you do them well, they can have they can be pretty reliable. Now, the one that is like the gold standard um, is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is the clinical test that's used almost exclusively uh, to um, to diagnose a personality disorder. We'll talk more about those um, in the clinical psych unit. But when we talk about the MMPI, we're talking about a test that has over, well over 200 different questions that were empirically derived um, and analyzed through factor analysis and all these things, and that then allowed this test to be really the gold standard. It can only be administered by a personality psychologist or a clinical psychologist. This isn't something that you can just take online and get results from, right? It's looking for someone with an emotional disorder or a personality disorder. So it's not something that you're just going to find online. Now, I have sample questions that will be posted on Schoology as just like a document that you can read, so that you can see what types of questions are being asked. But the thought process is, again, if we're looking at tests that are trying to diagnose, one of the things that's important is there are so many questions that it becomes hard to lie on all of them, right? You're answering questions. Like sometimes this takes multiple visits to complete the MMPI. So when we're talking about like remembering what I said for this question, right, that can be really difficult if it's a test that's going to span a few hours to take. So, it actually, because of its length and because of it's so robust and all the things that it covers, it really does give us a good indication of if someone has, a disorder or not. So like I said, we'll take a look at that. Now, you guys might be more familiar with the Myers-Briggs, which is different. We'll talk about the Myers-Briggs as actually not the most reliable personality test that you can take. I know some people swear by it, but as hopefully you guys have learned by now, we're going to look at the data, and I have an assignment actually that's going to have you, it's a podcast, surprise, surprise, where it goes into the Myers-Briggs and how it was created and some of the pitfalls that come with that. So stay tuned for that when we come back from break here. Okay, so self-report inventories are important. MMPI is important. We know that biology plays a role in our personality development. But let's wrap up by really talking about what does it mean to have a self. So we know, right, just this idea of who am I, right, is meant to get at your self-concept. But really, what is that? When we think about ourself, right, me as a distinct individual, I'm usually thinking about my personality, right? Those thoughts, feelings, and actions that are pretty consistent over time. When I think of myself, it's usually not things that are transitory, right? These are things that are a little bit more stable, at least when you think about them yourself, yourself. Ooh, bad joke. Not a joke. Pun. I don't even know. Sorry. So let's talk about all these different types of terms that relate to self and understand what the differences are between, a self concept in an individualistic Western society and self concept in a collective, Eastern society. So when we talk about the self concept, it's basically a list of characterizations that one identifies with. These could be things like demographics. Where are you from? What is your ethnicity and background? What are your personality traits? How about your relationship to others, right? How do you identify there? So in other words, one of the things that I like to do is, and this is, again, it would be better if we were together, is to think about, I am blank 20 times, right? 20 I am statements. And in any way that comes to mind, right, then those are your self concepts, right? Those are the main things that define who you are. So if you want to take a few minutes and think about that, I'd encourage you to do it because it is actually a good practice to kind of reflect on who you are, especially for that paper you have to write. So, we can even divide these further, right? We can talk about the personal self, right? This is how we really see ourselves in Western societies, right? The things that make me different from others, right? The physical characteristics and traits, these things that emphasize the way that we're different from other people. These make up the personal or independent self that we sometimes might think about, right? These are the things that apply to you. Let's contrast those with the interpersonal self, right? They're more focused on our relationship with others, right? So, you look at some of these: daughter, sister, American, right? These are things that help us identify with groups of other people, right? Members of our family, members of our school community, members of our ethnicities. Those kinds of things are interpersonal, but they still identify you, right? They still have meaning to you. So culturally speaking, while everybody has these mix of personal and interpersonal aspects to a self-concept, Western cultures tend to emphasize the personal ones, and Eastern cultures tend to emphasize the interpersonal ones. When we do the 20 statements test, Americans of European ancestry, right, of the Western society, if you will, that more individualistic societies typically give more answers reflecting the personal self as opposed to the interpersonal self, whereas that those numbers are reversed when we look at the more collective cultures in East Asia and India. They tend to identify themselves first, mostly as members of the community, and then individual aspects about themselves. Whereas, European Americans tend to focus more on the, unique characterizations of us as a individual, right? Not us as within the community. So this ties back into self schemas, going back to Piaget and thinking about what schemas are. So a self schema is a coherent image of the self that coordinates various different items, right? So like, how do we make sense of the fact that I'm, it was on the screen, but it's true for me that I'm Irish. I'm of Irish ancestry, but I'm also an American, right? Like, how do I make sense of that? Just those types of things, right? How we identify as ourselves versus how, these other components that we might understand ourselves to have, right? How do we recognize them as like a whole, as a cohesive whole? And that's really where the self schema comes in. So thinking about, vocab terms or memory things, right? Because remember, schemas are a cognitive thing. If we can relate the things to ourselves, we tend to remember more of them, right? So if there's vocab terms, if you're in an English class and you have to memorize all these new vocab terms, putting yourself as like the subject, like I am this or I am not this, that self-referential component to your memory makes it much more likely that you'll remember those things. So in this study where we have the data here, participants were asked to answer questions about the font, rhyming, meaning, or self-relevance of a list of words, right? So font would be structural, rhyming would be phonemic, etc. Those asked whether the word described themselves well showed a much higher recall than these other measures that they were asked to look at, right? So we know that semantic encoding is deeper than phonemic, but self-referential encoding is the deepest, right? That's where we talk about deep processing. So when we relate things back to ourselves, we have a higher level of recall because it's attaching itself to our self schema, right? How we understand ourselves. All these self terms, let's talk about self-esteem, right? We talk a lot about self-esteem, right? Our culture is very focused on self-esteem. Let's give a definition here. So self-esteem is the general belief that one is a good, worthy, and valuable person. These feelings are influenced by acceptance or rejection by caregivers in childhood, as well as our social comparisons throughout life, right? Do we feel like we're valued? Do we feel like we're a worthy person, right? And this often comes in relationship with others. Our self-esteem is usually tied to how we are viewed by other people. Some interesting statistics and data, I guess. While the goal is for everyone to have high self-esteem, right? I'm not saying I'm not a monster and think that we should have low self-esteem. Like having a good sense of esteem, feeling worthy and valued is super important for all of us, right? Especially the humanistic psychologists that we've been studying, right? This is a major driver of what they're trying to get at. But when we think about whether that leads to a successful life, there's not really much of a causal direction here. So we do know that people with high self-esteem tend to have good social relationships, but people with extremely high self-esteem can be bullies and judgmental, as well as being popular, right? There's two sides of the same coin, right? People with really high self-esteem can kind of have these negative personality traits too. And we do see this correlation between self-esteem and success, but the effect of success on self-esteem is stronger than the reverse. So when you are successful, you then tend to have higher self-esteem, as opposed to having high self-esteem that then leads to you being successful, right? So the feel-good messages that we have don't actually reflect achievement. So if you're told like you can do anything, blah blah blah, and then you're failing at those things, talk about the incongruent self-image back from our first video, right? That's going to lead to a backfire effect, that motivation is going to drop because you've been told that you can do it. You're finding out that you can't. Well, then why bother trying in the first place? Whereas having a more realistic self-esteem that's tied to, things that are true about you, and accepting who you are and having those feelings of worth coming from within, as opposed to just always being compared to others, is super important for growth. So self-esteem is important. Not saying that it's not. It's just not that like we need to boost everyone's self-esteem and then everybody will be good. It's more than that, right? It's more about understanding, taking our constant social comparisons away and focusing more on, the things that we actually have and can change and we can do. Which ties us into the last slide of the notes here. And it's one of the most important vocab terms that we're going to cover. Just like locus of control, self-efficacy almost always shows up on an FRQ. I think it's been, out of the last 10 years, I'll say 7 times out of the last 10 years, self-efficacy shows up on an FRQ, and it's certainly in the AP multiple choice questions. One of the reasons is most people confuse self-esteem for self-efficacy, but they are very different. In fact, whereas when we saw that self-esteem has, is correlated to success, but it's usually, the success leads to self-esteem. Self-efficacy is more important for leading to success. So what is it? Self-efficacy is the belief that one can accomplish your goals and control your outcomes. That's it. The belief that you are in control. It's really a strong sense of an internal locus of control. People with high self-efficacy, I almost made the mistake. People with high self-efficacy put more effort into their goals and tasks because they believe they're within reach, right? They understand what is needed to be successful, and then they set out a path to accomplish those things, which makes them more likely to succeed than someone who's kind of giving up. Thinking again about how, how we view ourselves, our sense of value and worth, right? Self-esteem. If you're not hitting those goals, if I just feel like I am the best and I, feel great about myself, well, then you might not try as hard when confronted with something challenging, right? Because why would you? You're the best. Self-efficacy, on the other hand, forces us to understand, like, hey, the things that I want are in my control. I can accomplish my goals if I set my mind to it, and that those things are much more powerful predictors of success than self-esteem is. And they can be different from different aspects, right? Think about someone who might have a higher self-efficacy for academics as opposed to athletics, or vice versa, right? So I might not think that I might know that I'm not the best baseball player. And no matter what I do, I might get better, I might not, but I'm a pretty good student. I'm going to devote more of my effort to being a good student because that's where my strong self-efficacy is, right? I believe that I can impact that more than, there are a lot of variables in baseball that, maybe I'm, just uncoordinated, and no matter what I do, I can't get better at that. So let me double down my efforts on things that I can improve. So self-efficacy, the belief that you control your goals and the outcomes, is much more important for our success and for, honestly, living a good and fulfilled life than is our belief in our self-esteem. So sorry for the length of this video. I know it's a little bit longer, but I thought it was important to wrap everything up here. So in this video, we went over the biological basis of personality and saw that there is a major biological and genetic component to our personality. We talked about how we assess personality, mostly through self-report inventories. When we looked at the gold standard for diagnostic criteria in personality disorders, the MMPI. And then we talked about the self, right? And we contrasted the personal self and the interpersonal self. We looked at how that changes over culture. And then we wrapped up by talking about self-esteem and self-efficacy. Any questions that you have, please make sure you're writing them down so that we can discuss them in class together. When we get back, we will talk about psychodynamic theories on personality, and that'll kind of tie the bow on everything. And we'll be looking for a test, relatively soon after break. If you guys have any questions that are kind of eating away at you, and you can't wait that long to discuss them, please shoot me an email or a Schoology message, and I will get back to you when I see them. Uh, Guys, I hope you enjoy the rest of your break, and if you have any questions, you guys know how to reach out. And don't forget about your Who Am I paper. Okay, I will see you guys next time that I see you.